The Trump administration plans on using tariffs or higher taxes on foreign goods as a negotiation tool to benefit U.S. consumers. Hiccups could come into play if our trading partners retaliate with their own tariffs. But what would that mean for agriculture? Chuck Nicholson is an associate professor in agricultural economics and dairy science at UW-Madison. He's created some models to predict what the exact cost would be for a Wisconsin dairy farm if our top trading partners retaliated.
There can be some benefits to the U.S. populations of having those tariffs in place, but most of those are not the kind of benefits that are going to accrue to folks working in agricultural supply chains from the input suppliers on through the retail stores. So what we're looking at in terms of the context is really our three major export destinations for dairy products are Mexico, Canada, and China. So if we were to do some things with our trade policy towards those three countries, and they do some things back to us with trade policy, that can actually be rather detrimental to our possibilities to selling into those export markets. And to kind of underscore the importance of those, about 40% of all of the dairy product exports by value goes to those three markets. So those are really vitally important for not just now and in the short term, but for our future growth opportunities.
Is dairy something that the federal government necessarily puts a lot of weight onto? I mean, it's pretty small potatoes if you total up all the other industries that have products moving in and out.
Yeah, I mean, dairy is about a $9 billion a year export value for the United States, which most of us would agree is a pretty important value. Anybody would like to have $9 million of something every year. If you put that into the context, though, of the total value of agricultural exports, dairy is a fairly small share of those because we're a big exporter of corn, soybean, other grains, sometimes even cattle and genetics. If you put that into the even broader context of the total exports that we have of all different kinds of products coming out of the U.S., dairy would barely show up on the bar chart for that. So for our industry, for the dairy industry in Wisconsin and nationally, exports are a pretty big deal. They're a major source of revenue for us that we don't want to go away. Whether or not that $9 billion a year is kind of enough to get the attention of policymakers in Washington is a little bit of an interesting question. I guess the other part of this, though, is it's important to think about what the attention that our policymakers are going to pay to dairy. But it's maybe even more important to think about what policymakers in other countries are going to do in terms of paying attention to dairy, because their decisions about those retaliatory tariffs are going to be the things that matter. And I think we learned in our experience in a previous Trump administration that other countries know that agriculture is kind of a particularly politically sensitive place where they can try to get back at us. And so whatever we do, they may retaliate in a way that's a little bit stronger and bigger in agriculture and dairy because they know that's something that gets people's attention in the United States.
Have you been able to model that, what that could look like, and maybe the hit that the U.S. would take if we did have retaliatory tariffs?
Yeah, sure. So I have done some modeling work trying to look at three areas of concern that I see with the policy ideas, and I think they're really just ideas at this point that have been put forward. One of those is related to tariffs, another is really related to what happens with the availability of labor on dairy farms and in the rest of the dairy supply chain, and the third is on the amount of money that we spend on food nutrition programs. On the tariff issue specifically, if I can think about the kinds of numbers that we're looking at here, if we impose tariffs on those countries and they retaliated against us, we're looking at a fairly significant nationwide reduction in the net farm income, that is the profits that farms earn on dairy. That looks like about $2.5 billion or about 8% reduction. So that'd be like getting an 8% cut in your paycheck kind of thing. On an average size Wisconsin dairy farm, that would mean about $35,000 over the course of the next 4 years or so, another about 8%. Significant reduction in key export and domestic markets for us for cheese, something like about a $6 billion reduction in the value of cheese sales. And importantly, particularly given that this is a focus on trade, a nearly one-third reduction in the total value of our dairy product exports going out of the United States. So when we think about the kinds of impacts that this could have, generally speaking, they're pretty important in terms of reducing farm incomes and reducing the total value of the dairy stream that's going out of the United States.
As you said, tariffs can be a tool to get the U.S. what it wants. Have you been able to model what a positive outcome could be if President Trump achieves his goal with tariffs?
Well, so there's a potential possibility for some positive impacts on dairy, at least in some ways, because, as I mentioned earlier, we export a lot of grains that can be fed to dairy cattle, so corn and soybeans. If those products also see retaliatory tariffs and a lot more of that product is kept at home, then feed costs, the prices for those commodities and therefore feed costs on a dairy farm for a dairy ration could go down. And it depends a little bit on which of those effects is bigger. We're sort of taking away demand in the marketplace for dairy products. That's going to mean lower dairy product prices, lower farm milk prices. But if we also have lower feed costs, that could be an offsetting effect to a certain amount. It really depends on which one of those effects ends up being a little bit stronger. Is it that falling milk prices or is it the falling feed costs? Not quite a race to the bottom, but it would make a difference on how those two things were affected.
You also mentioned labor and worker shortages putting a squeeze on the farm economy. But the third point you said, cuts to food and nutrition programs.
We kind of have this idea that the things that are in the Farm Bill include those food and nutrition programs, and they're actually like 3/4 of the total amount of money that we spend on the Farm Bill is actually for things that is not directly related to farms. It's related to allowing people to purchase more food. So there's a broad set of potential impacts if we cut those programs. What I've done is try and look at, particularly for dairy, the kind of impacts that cutting those programs by a significant amount would have on dairy product demand. And many people maybe don't know, but a lot of fluid milk products in the U.S. and a lot of cheese are moved through a variety of those food and nutrition programs that have been under discussion for some pretty significant cuts. And that means the school breakfast and lunch programs move a little bit less than 10% of the total fluid milk that is sold in the United States. So these are really actually pretty important programs. And if we cut them in ways that have been discussed, we can see some similar kind of impacts to what we might see with the tariff. We see some pretty significant reductions in farm income. You're dropping the demand for dairy products in the U.S. That is not going to help with farm milk prices, not going to help with the value of sales. Might provide a little bit of a boost for export sales because we're going to have lower domestic prices, and that allows us to be a little bit more competitive in global markets. But the overall net impact of making changes, making cuts to those programs is pretty important because of the demand role that they play for dairy products.
And the Farm Bill, that's beyond the Trump administration. I mean, Congress needs to move that through. What are the expectations that it's the 2023 Farm Bill is going to get done in 2025?
Never say never, I guess, but the conversations that I've been hearing for people who work in Washington or otherwise kind of inside the discussions are not pretty optimistic that we're going to have a 2025 Farm Bill, which would mean something happening this year. Doesn't mean that we're going to see massive changes in farm policy. We can do the continuation, which is kind of what we did at the end of last year, and maintain many of those programs in place, just not make any substantive changes to them that might be beneficial. So, for example, one of the things that was discussed and put into the kind of language that they used to write up the legislation, the Farm Bill, is actually increasing the production caps for the lowest Tier 1 on the Dairy Margin Coverage Program. Okay, so that would have some marginal benefits for dairy farmers, particularly in that mid-range size category. If we don't get a Farm Bill done, we're not going to be changing that. So, there's some potential downsides to that, but it's not like a disaster scenario. This is more about the kind of the political inertia and the budget inertia getting stuff done.
And again, these are only models showing the ifs of tariff policies, not a prediction of the future. These models are meant to be additional information for decision makers in Washington, D.C. Chuck Nicholson, along with us. He's an associate professor in agricultural economics and dairy science at UW-Madison. For the Midwest Farm Report, I'm Stephanie Hoff.